Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Blue Line the Podcast, a podcast created for and aimed at all members of law enforcement. I'm Brittani Schroeder, editor of Blue Line magazine. Today, I'm joined by Brian Carwana, who provides religious literacy programs to communities and organizations. We will be discussing the importance of knowing the different religions present in Canadian society and how that knowledge will help officers in their daily roles. Thank you so much for joining me today, Brian.
Thanks, Brittany. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I'm really excited. I think this is a really important conversation, so I'm glad we're having it today. And to start us off, I'd like to discuss the diversity in Canadian communities that we have. Can you share with our listeners maybe some statistics on the different religions and faiths Canadians recognize and follow?
Yeah, I can tell you that, there are lots of, I think religious literacy is helpful for policing anywhere, but it is difficult to find a country where it's as valuable and as important as Canada, to a degree that will shock most Canadians and most listeners. So, for example, if you're police here, you might think, well, my colleagues south of the border have a similar situation. And to a degree, that's true, but to a degree, it is at a completely different level. If you were to look at sort of religious minorities and look at how many there are in the States versus Canada, and adjust for population size, we all know the States is 10 times bigger than us. But if you adjust for population size, what you would find is that we have fewer Jews. We have about 40% fewer Jews when you adjust per capita. But when it comes to Buddhists, we have a lot more. We have 100% more. When it comes to Hindus, we have 150% more. When it comes to Muslims, we actually have 4 times as many Muslims per capita as there is in the United States. And when it comes to the Sikh community, we actually have about 12 to 15 times as many as there are in the States. In fact, ignoring population size, we probably have more Sikhs just numerically than the 350 million person country to the south. We have more Sikhs as a percentage of the population than perhaps any country on earth. India has more Sikhs, but there's 1.4 billion people, so they make up like 1.7%. But here it's about 2.1.
Wow.
I don't have the stats off the top of my head for the UK, but I've looked at it. It's, the individual numbers change, but it's the same picture. And so what I would say to your listeners is, police in this country are dealing with a level of religious diversity that is above and beyond even other diverse liberal democracies. And that's the picture today. But we also know that while everyone knows we're more diverse today than we've ever been. The number of Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus have all doubled in the past 20 years. But we also know going forward, somehow both statements are true. We're more diverse than we've ever been, and we will never be as less diverse, if I can say that, as we are today. Right?
Yeah.
Another 5 or 10 years, it's going to be more so. And so, yeah, what I would say to our listeners, and if you're running the police service or whatever, your staff is dealing with a situation that is really almost unprecedented.
Definitely. And let's dive into that. So we've kind of touched on it, and what we're going to talk about more in this podcast is the police literacy and understanding these religions so that they can accurately serve and properly serve the people in Canada. So do you want to just give us some thoughts on that? Because I know you work with police quite often. So let's talk about the importance of them understanding the differences between everyone here.
Yeah, thanks, Brittany. We always say to police services that religious literacy will affect and is important on kind of 3 different fronts. The first is obviously that it gives you a better understanding of the public that you serve. We were just talking about how diverse the public is. It helps in all sorts of ways. To give a small example, in Canada, when non-Muslims see a woman with a hijab, with a headscarf, sometimes there can be a kind of bias that this woman is uh, dominated by her husband or maybe her father. And of course, there are rare instances where that is true because in any community in Canada, there are sometimes men who behave this way towards women. But overwhelmingly, that is not the case. I cannot tell you how many times I've run into couples where the husband has said, I wish she wouldn't wear it. And often, frankly, it's because of safety. They're worried that she's going to be accosted somewhere. And if I can give an example, in Alberta, remember in 2021, in the first quarter of the year in Alberta, there were 7 incidents of Muslim women being attacked in either Calgary or Edmonton. Public spaces, parks, bus stops, the mall. They were all brown women. They all had a hijab, and they were all kicked and punched and beaten and had their headscarf ripped off. In that context, for the woman to wear the headscarf is actually often kind of an act of sort of defiance and bravery. It was the same thing after 9/11 for a lot of women. It's been the same thing last year or so. And so it changes the way you see the woman wearing that headscarf, right? To have that kind of literacy and say, no, overwhelmingly, this is her choice. And it is done sometimes even sometimes there's a level of insecurity that comes with it. And the woman sort of chooses to do it. So that bias, it changes the bias, right? And it helps in a lot of ways. The person's averting your eyes. Is that a sign of guilt? Or is it because you're a different gender and there's a modesty norm in that particular sort of culture? Understanding the lack of security. There are certain communities, Jews, for example, who have a visceral sense that security is never something you can take for granted, right? It's not something they read in a history book. It's something they learned at their grandmother's knee because she lost all of her family or something like that. And it's, how do you do a body search sensitively? Can you get someone of the same gender? It's knowing what this object is on this person's body. And if you don't have to deal with it, you don't deal with it. If you do have to deal with it, you at least know to say to the person, look, I'm really sorry. I know what this is. I do have to look at it. And then you treat it a different way. You don't toss it on the pile. It's all those things that just allow us to understand the public better and to act with, more wisdom, essentially, because we've got some background to go on. So that's the first thing. It helps you understand those communities better. The second is it helps us create a more inclusive workplace. It can be hard, I think, to be a minority in a workplace, to be the only person or one of only of a few people to sort of stand out. It can affect that sort of sense of belonging. There is a study done in Canada about 3 years ago. It's not for police, it's for workplaces generally. But within the Canadian workplaces, it asks the most basic question. The most basic question is, do you feel comfortable speaking up at work? And the group in Canada that scored the absolute worst were religious minorities. It was about 40% said, yeah, I'm not really comfortable speaking up at work. And that's, that has all sorts of implications. Like those people, then they don't get noticed, they don't get promoted. It hurts retention. And even if you retain them because they've committed to the profession, when others from the community say, tell me about policing, they're less likely to say, this is great, right? So you're losing a lot. One of the police services we dealt with, I really admired this. They kind of went the extra level and asked us to come in and speak about minority religions, including Wicca and neo-paganism. And when we did, it turned out one of the officers, unknown to me and unknown to the rest of the staff, was herself a pagan. And she wrote me an email and said that, during the talk, she'd been sort of tearing up because she said, I've hidden this from everybody for, something like 10 years or something. So that's the second thing. It helps to create an inclusive workplace where, everybody feels like they belong. And the third thing, so it helps us understand the communities better. It helps create a more inclusive workplace. But the third thing is, and this is often missed, is it helps those communities to know you better, right? Like police need trust. They need trust for collaboration. They need contact points. They need helpful contacts, useful information. And getting to know these communities and having the literacy to do it helps them to know you. And I do want to say to folks, I've had the privilege of taking people to houses of worship for 25 years. And people often say to me, including police, are we intruding? Do they want us to come? Is this a burden? And the truth is they want you to come. They often feel like they don't get to speak for themselves, that the image of them is crafted in the media and on social media, and they want to tell their stories. And people want to be seen and heard. And so going there, they get to tell their story and they get to know you. They get to know your face. They take your business card. If you show up a few times, then you've got them on your phone and you can text them and stuff. And they feel like they can text you. So all of those things. You'll know the communities better. It creates a more inclusive workplace for your staff, but also those communities will know you better. And all of that just leads to, policing that's more effective, that's safer for officers, that's fair, and that creates a sense of connection between officers and between the communities they serve.
And that I think is so important, especially these days, which kind of leads into my next question. There are many global conflicts over the last few years. And my question for you is, how will this literacy help officers approach incidents like protests and hate crimes? And yeah, how will that help?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that's been really front of mind in a lot of the folks that we've been dealing with the last year and a half, especially. So obviously, just having background allows us to be more sensitive to understand things like the way anti-Semitism affects Jews, the sense for many of the Palestinians are sort of invisible. Like just having the background allows you to approach it sort of differently, allows you to, I think it creates more patience and more empathy. It can help us to understand little nuances too. Maybe you go to protests and there's some slogan that someone's shouting or that's on a banner, from the river to the sea. So what does that mean? Well, it depends. It's knowing that the speaker could mean several different things on that. And some of them might be quite terrible, and some of them might not be quite terrible. And then it's also understanding how is that slogan going to be heard by Jews? Because overwhelmingly, from Jews, it's heard in the manner that is kind of most threatening. Right. So it just gives you context that when you see that slogan to understand all of the nuances that are at play here. And as I say, understanding anti-Semitism and things like that. It helped us understand things like hate crimes too. I have a friend who's a Muslim police officer, and I've always remembered this. He said to me, Brian, hate crimes are different because if someone comes and steals your bike, they're after your bike and really just affects you. But when there's a hate crime, they're after you, and it affects the entire community. And I've seen police services deal with this really well sometimes. Do you remember, Brittany, in 2014, there was the attack in Ottawa at the Parliament buildings? Man was killed. The
Mhm.
guy who did that, I mean, he had a terrible mental health history, but he also got into some Islamic extremism. And I remember at the time, the Ottawa police, tweeted out a notice that if any Muslim folks were feeling threatened or unsafe, that they should reach out to them. Like that was the sort of understanding, right? Of, this is going to affect this whole community. And just tweeting it out said something to everyone in the community. It happened too after the Christchurch attack. Same thing. There were some police services that tweeted out and said, "Look, if you need, we're going to be stepping up protections around mosques," and that's preventative, right? It prevents something from happening. It sends a message to those communities that the police are looking out for you, that they're your allies, and it also sends out a message to the community. I know we live in an era where the police have been attacked and sometimes denigrated in recent years, but there's also a fair amount of research that voices of authority matter. They help to set norms. And if you have those connections, if something happens, you can text the person who you know and say, "Hey, how are you folks feeling? What can we do to help?" It allows you to act and to do things like this that it create a different environment, might help prevent crime and change norms really for the whole community to some degree.
Course. And now we've talked about the importance of having this religious literacy, but how? We haven't talked, we've touched on it a little bit, but how can officers actually increase their knowledge on the different religions out there? How can officers keep the lines of communication open with, like you said, fellow officers in the workplace and then community members as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I would say is in Canada, there is a norm that we're not supposed to talk about religion. Some of us were literally taught that, right? We were taught growing up, hey, the one thing you need to know is don't talk about this. And I encourage people in every setting, including when I'm talking in high tech firms or wherever, um, throw that out. Religion is already in your workplace and in your communities, and not talking about it. You're not. It's not about doctrines. It's literally about the person next to you and stuff, and the community you serve. So to try not to be afraid to talk about it. So what can you do though about that? One I think, which I was hinting at the previous answer, is to try and establish relationships, to try and show up at the mosque, to try and show up at the Hindu temple, to try and make contacts, to then come again during Ramadan or during Diwali. Let yourself be seen, let yourself be known. try and get to the point where you know a few people in that community amongst the leaders, and they know you, know maybe a couple of your colleagues. All of that, just builds trust, and it creates, as I was just an example earlier, it's someone you can text when something's going on and saying, how is your community feeling about this? Second, I think it's to tap into internal resources. Do you have minority officers on staff? Are they willing to be a point person? Because they often have, they have knowledge, they grew up in the community, they know its norms, they know nuances, they have a network of contacts. You do have to be careful about burning them out. It can be a little exhausting to be like, I am the spokesperson for, all Hindus in this region or something like that. But trying to build up those internal resources, and part of that is as well to cultivate a work environment that will make them belong. So that's obviously recruiting. It's also sometimes mentorship programs are really good. If you have some officers around who are already in that community, if they're willing to be mentors, then if a younger officer is joining, they don't have to choose that person as a mentor, but if they want, sometimes it's helpful for them to have somebody who says, yeah, I've navigated this. Let me tell you about it, and things like that. And there's other things about workplace inclusion. They include food. Food is a really big thing. We all bond over food. If you're going out on a date, you go for food. If you want to get to know your neighbor, you invite them over for tea or a barbecue. Obviously, holidays. And something else we talked about is inclusive scheduling. Inclusive scheduling is if you're leading a team of officers and a few of them have, routinely take certain religious holidays off. In January, in the first week of January, pull out your calendar and find out when those holidays are and mark them on your calendar. And the reason is you try to make sure that you don't schedule anything important on the wallet, right? Because it will put that person in a bind where either they're with their family and they're missing out on a big work event, or they do the work event and, are leaving aside their family and their tradition. I've heard of this, I've seen this happen. I've seen it happen with a SVP of a national retailer. It was a big offsite on Diwali. He went to it, didn't want to raise a stink, didn't want to tell anyone, and it went into the evening, and he missed what is essentially Christmas for Hindus. They just gutted him. So things like this. So making sure that you create an environment that's sort of welcoming. And the other thing I would say is to seek out education. There are speakers, there are workshops. We have free resources at our website. They're not specifically geared for police or for work environments, but they've been very popular with police and others. And they're little guides for free that say, okay, how do you create a welcoming workplace for Jews and for Hindus? And it's just things like things about food, things about holidays, things you didn't know about the tradition, misconceptions that develop. So trying to tap into whatever resources you can find. And all of those things, being willing to talk about it, establishing those relationships, showing up for holidays, creating an inclusive work environment, and then trying to actually pursue education, I think is it's ongoing. There's no single, light switch you can sort of turn on. But over time it will make a difference. It will build on itself.
Of course. And like you said, it's not something you're going to learn overnight. It's going to be a continuous education. And the more you learn, the more you'll be able to connect with people.
Yeah. I often say really knowledge is sticky. The first 5% of a topic is the hardest thing to learn because you don't even have the skeleton. So you don't know where things go. Right. But once you get over that first 5 or 10%, then you learn something else and you go, oh, this is kind of like this. And so that first part takes a bit of courage, but after that, it will build.
I like that. Knowledge is sticky. I like it. Brian, is there anything else that we haven't touched on already that you think is important to share with our listeners today?
Oh, and what I would say is maybe sometimes we think of this as a burden, but I would encourage you not to. Learning is rewarding. It is so much better to walk into an environment where imagine there's some incident, there was some incidents recently with Hindus and Sikhs in some communities in Canada. How different is it to show up and to already know a couple of the people in that community and to already have some background knowledge and to know, oh, this is about this issue. And so the questions you ask immediately are at a different depth. You feel competent. You feel knowledgeable. You feel more knowledgeable. You don't feel like, well, I have no idea what's going on here. and you're dealing with serious stuff. And so having that kind of confidence and ease is good. And it's also really nice, honestly, to have a different kind of relationship with your colleague, to have the comfort to say, hey, what are you doing for Diwali? I don't know much about it. Tell me about it. Or their kids getting ready for a bar mitzvah. How is that going? What do they practice? Tell me about it. We like to connect, right? We spend a lot of hours at work. And so if you can spend those hours connected to the people around you and feeling more competent when you walk into situations, and even maybe seeing someone who's kind of someone you consider maybe friend is too strong a word, but you're at least friendly with, it's better. You can do your job better and it's more enjoyable and you feel better about yourself.
I think that's some great advice right there. So, Brian, I just want to say thank you so much again for joining me on today's episode. This is such an important conversation to have, especially in today's world. So, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brittany. Again, my hat's off to you. I really appreciate this opportunity. So thanks for the invitation.
Oh, I'm so happy you had a good time. For everyone who tuned in, we hope you had a good time as well. And we hope you enjoyed the episode of Blue Line the podcast. You can check us out on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also stay up to date on all of your Canadian policing news at blueline.ca. Until next time, stay safe and be well.